Welcome, the anointed ones. When a real one aligns with God, hell doesn't just tremble, it files a complaint. Let that marinate. Because what we're about to talk about isn't for the faint-hearted, the copy-paste prophets, or the motivational meme dealers. This is for the chosen ones, those who shook entire bloodlines just by waking up and deciding to walk with God instead of walking with everybody else. Fact. Neuroscience confirms that a single aligned individual with a calm, purpose-driven brainwave pattern can influence the nervous systems of people around them. Translation? When you aligned with God, you didn't just change your life, you fried the circuitry of an entire town's fake peace. You weren't loud about it either. You didn't need a microphone. Your obedience was the broadcast. And now, look around. The same ones who laughed at you are trying to channel your frequency with broken antennas. It's actually funny. If it wasn't so tragic, they rehearsed your walk but skipped your wilderness. They copied your anointing but forgot the crushing. They're doing the motions, yet still moving backwards, spiritually moonwalking like it's a gospel thriller video. But why did your divine alignment shake them this hard? Why are your copycats glitching while you keep rising? Stick around, because what I'm about to reveal will explain why your life caused a spiritual earthquake, and why the aftershocks are still rattling them today. Let's get into it. Number 1, your divine alignment. Didn't just expose darkness, it disarmed entire bloodlines. You didn't just start walking with God, you unintentionally started shaking graves. Your alignment didn't only expose fake friends or shady church folk, it reached deeper and triggered a disturbance in the very bloodlines of people around you. See, when you aligned with divine truth, it didn't just change your behavior. It started to dismantle spiritual agreements your town had unknowingly been living under for decades. The moment you came into agreement with God, everything around you that was built on lies, manipulation, and generational cycles started to unravel. That's why people started acting strange. That's why folks who never cared about you suddenly got loud. That's why people in power started watching you like a threat. You were never just an individual to them. Spiritually, you represented a disruption. Your alignment forced a confrontation with the things they inherited and passed down quietly, abuse that was normalized, pride that was worshipped, silence that covered up shame. You didn't need to say a word to threaten them. You being clean in a town that made peace with filth was enough. Some of them have been operating off the same ancestral demons for years, and here you come, breaking the cycle, saying no to dysfunction, refusing to repeat what your own family once called normal. They saw that, and it terrified them. Why? Because if you could get free, it meant they never had to stay bound. And that kind of truth burns. You walked into rooms where spirits had ruled for generations, and you didn't bow. You didn't kiss rings. You didn't play along. You aligned with something higher, and that's when the town got nervous. Not because you were dangerous, but because your obedience exposed their comfort with darkness. You weren't loud, but spiritually, you were an earthquake. And the aftershocks are still being felt by people pretending they're unbothered, yet watching your every move. That's the power of real alignment. It doesn't just shake people, it uproots the systems they swore were untouchable. Number 2, the town wasn't shocked by your light. They were terrified that you remembered who you are. The town wasn't shocked because you suddenly changed. They were shocked because you remembered who you are. That's the part that messed with them. You didn't become someone new. You woke up to the truth that had been buried under years of survival, trauma, guilt, and programming. When you started aligning with God, you didn't add anything to yourself. You started peeling things off. That purity, that authority, that insight, they were always there. The real shakeup happened when you stopped doubting what you carried, when you stopped shrinking, when you stopped playing dumb to keep other people comfortable. And once that switch flipped, it was too late to unsee it. You weren't supposed to wake up. You were supposed to stay numb. You were supposed to keep doubting yourself, keep waiting for their validation, keep thinking your value came from how well you could be used. But the moment you saw yourself through God's lens, you started moving different. You stopped chasing tables you were meant to flip. You stopped explaining your essence to people who were committed to misunderstanding it. You stopped leaking energy trying to prove your worth to people who secretly hoped you'd never find it. And that's what scared them most. You found it. You found your rhythm, your voice, your knowing. And when you did, their illusion shattered. Because your awakening forced a silent audit of their own lives. Your peace made their chaos louder. Your boundaries made their manipulation obvious. Your alignment made their stagnation painful. You walking in purpose became a mirror they never asked for but couldn't avoid. They weren't reacting to the new you, they were reacting to the fact that the real you was never broken, just buried. They were fine with you being lost. But now you're found. And worse, for them, you remembered you were never really missing. That's what shook them. Because now that you remember, they can't unsee what you carry. And no matter how much they pretend they don't notice, their spirit already bowed. Number 3. Your copycats rehearsed your anointing without surviving your hell. They copied your walk but skipped your wilderness. That's the problem. They tried to imitate what they saw on the surface, your confidence, your words, your strength, but they didn't live through the nights you cried yourself to sleep. They didn't feel the crushing, the isolation, the moments when God stripped everything you leaned on just to rebuild you from the inside out. They want the fruit, but didn't survive the drought. That's why their version of you doesn't carry the same weight. It looks similar, but it has no spiritual backing, no oil, just performance. Your life cost you everything, but it produced something eternal. You went through fire, but instead of burning, you were refined. They want to skip straight to the shine without enduring the heat. That's why their copy feels hollow. Because while you were breaking soul ties, fighting off depression, forgiving people who never apologized, and dying to your old self, they were watching from the sidelines, taking notes like they could study their way into anointing. But this isn't school. This is war. And your victories were earned in a place they're too scared to go. They thought your glow came from attention, not realizing it came from survival. You didn't just wake up one day full of wisdom and peace. You paid in pain. You paid in obedience. You paid in letting go of people you loved because they were killing your spirit. That's not something you can copy. That's something you have to live. And most of them aren't built for it. That's why, no matter how hard they try to sound like you, move like you, post like you, it still falls flat. Because what you carry is born, not borrowed. They rehearsed your anointing without knowing that every word you speak was forged through fire. Every insight cost you a version of yourself. They're walking backwards because they skipped the process and tried to perform the outcome. And the truth is, what they're pretending to be still fears what you've already overcome. Number 4. Your awakening was a threat because it broke the town's illusion of control. Your awakening was more than just a personal transformation. It was a direct challenge to everything the town thought it knew about power and control. People thought they had everything figured out. Who should be in charge? Who should stay quiet? Who should lead? Who should follow? They built their systems on the illusion that everything had its place, and they, the so-called leaders, were the ones in control. But when you aligned with God, that illusion shattered. It wasn't just your actions that disturbed them. It was the fact that you operated under a power they couldn't manipulate. You weren't just another voice in the crowd. You became a mirror to everything they tried to cover up. The false narratives, the secret deals, the power plays, they all came crumbling down the moment you stepped into your purpose. You were a walking truth bomb, and the town couldn't handle the explosion. They never thought anyone would question their authority. They never imagined someone would rise with the kind of confidence that didn't need their approval, their rules, or their framework. By simply existing, you disrupted their systems. Their leaders, who wrapped themselves in religious language, suddenly couldn't hide the darkness they'd been using to maintain control. You didn't have to expose them. They exposed themselves when they saw your light. It was as if the very foundation they stood on was made of sand, and once you aligned with God, you revealed the cracks they'd spent years covering up. They saw you as a threat because your awakening didn't just challenge their position. It questioned their very right to have one. You weren't playing by their rules anymore. You didn't need their permission to exist as the person you were born to be. You were a living testament to what true power looks like, one that doesn't need manipulation, one that doesn't operate on fear, but one that stands firmly in truth. And that was the ultimate threat. You, standing in your truth, broke everything they tried to build on lies. Number 5. They tried to mock you publicly, but studied you privately. They couldn't figure you out, so they did what most people do when they're scared of something they don't understand. They mocked you. They laughed, made jokes, and called you weird, because it was easier to dismiss you than to confront what you represented. But here's the kicker. As soon as the lights went out, when the crowd wasn't watching, they were studying you. They were reading your every move, paying attention to how you stood tall even when they thought you'd fall, how you remained calm in chaos, how you carried an energy they couldn't quite grasp but secretly envied. In public, they ridiculed your authenticity. In private, they were consulting your spirit, trying to decode your strength like it was some hidden code they could crack. They'd go on social media or gather in groups and mock your decisions, your path, your connection with God. But behind closed doors, when no one was around to see, they were wondering how you made it through the storm, why your peace remained untouched, what it was that gave you the power to walk confidently in spaces they feared. They looked at your journey and thought, how do they keep rising? What are we missing? They were fascinated by your resilience, but too proud to admit they couldn't replicate it. They didn't want to acknowledge that what they saw in you wasn't just weirdness. It was divinely rooted power. They called it weird because they couldn't understand how you stood your ground without playing by their rules, how you thrived while they stagnated. But secretly they wanted it. They wanted your strength, your clarity, your calm in the storm. They were trying to channel your energy while pretending it didn't affect them. That's why they're still walking backwards. They're stuck in a loop of mimicking and performing, never realizing that true power isn't about copying someone else's journey. It's about standing on your own path and allowing the universe to guide you. And until they stop pretending, they'll keep walking in circles while you keep marching forward. Number 6. Your walk with God activated divine surveillance in the town. When you aligned with God, you didn't just shift your own reality. You activated a whole different level of spiritual awareness in your surroundings. You became a living courtroom. And the town, well, it became a courtroom too. Every word, every action, every thought that crossed anyone's mind in your presence was being scrutinized, weighed, and measured. Not by human standards, but by divine justice. You didn't just walk through town, you became a spiritual checkpoint. You weren't even trying to be a judge, but that's exactly how it felt to everyone around you. The moment you stepped in, it was as if the very atmosphere shifted. People started feeling the weight of their own choices. They could no longer pretend they were doing things in the shadows. Your walk with God turned the town into a place where nothing was hidden anymore. It wasn't just that people started treating you differently. They started to feel different when they were near you. Conversations began to change. The jokes weren't as funny. The lies weren't as convincing. Their bad habits, their bitterness, their unresolved issues. All of a sudden, it was like they couldn't hide from it. It was almost as if every part of their spirit was on trial, and they could sense it. Your alignment didn't just expose the fakes, it convicted them. The demons that had been roaming freely for years were now on the witness stand, being called to account, and no one could escape the truth that came with your presence. They felt watched because they were. But it wasn't you watching them. It was the weight of divine justice that followed you. They didn't know how to handle it. They couldn't run from their own darkness anymore, because every time they got close to you, that darkness had to face the light. You didn't have to point it out. You didn't have to say a word. Just being aligned with God activated a spiritual surveillance that had everyone checking their own hearts. They were nervous, uneasy, because they knew the game was over. The courtroom had opened, and they were being judged by a higher standard, whether they realized it or not. Number 7. You triggered a crisis in people who claimed to be healed. Your presence became a mirror to people who claimed to be healed, and the reflection wasn't pretty. They thought they were over it. The trauma, the pain, the old wounds they'd told everyone they'd worked through. But when you showed up, living in a peace that felt authentic and unshakable, their illusion of healing cracked wide open. The thing is, your peace wasn't performative. It wasn't something you put on like a coat to show the world that you were fine. Your peace was earned earned through the struggle, the battles, the sleepless nights where you wrestled with your own demons, and the moments when you decided to rise again after every setback. You didn't just say you were healed. You proved it through how you lived, how you responded to pain, how you moved through chaos without losing your sense of self. And that's what rattled them. Their healing was built on a carefully crafted performance, a show they put on for others to see, to gain validation, to avoid confronting the mess they hadn't really processed. They wanted the world to believe they had moved on, that they were whole, but you were a walking contradiction to everything they'd convinced themselves of. Your alignment with God was a glaring reminder that healing isn't about pretending you're fine. It's about walking through the fire and coming out unscathed because you faced it head-on, not because you bypassed it. Your wholeness made their act of wellness seem hollow. They could no longer hide behind their words or their Instagram quotes about overcoming adversity. They could no longer say, "I'm healed," without feeling the weight of their own brokenness underneath. Because your peace wasn't something you had to sell, it wasn't something you had to show off. It was something you lived, and that was the threat. They had been performing wellness to keep up with the image of healing, but you, simply by existing in your truth, exposed how far they still had to go. Their false healing cracked the moment they saw that you weren't performing, you were living the real thing. And that's what they couldn't handle. Number 8, you didn't just align with God. You realigned the spiritual grid. When you aligned with God, it wasn't just a personal shift, it was a cosmic reordering. You didn't simply change your life, you realigned the spiritual grid of the entire town. The moment you stepped into your full purpose, everything in that town felt the impact. The atmosphere itself began to respond to your alignment. Things that were once tolerated, things that people had grown comfortable with, started to feel unbearable. The lies, the manipulation, the toxic cycles, they couldn't hide behind masks anymore. The very air you walked through started to vibrate at a different frequency, one that made everything that was out of alignment stand out like a flashing red light. You weren't just walking through life anymore, playing along with the brokenness. You became the disruptor. Spiritual ley lines, the energetic currents that flow beneath a community, shifted when you showed up. Where people once turned a blind eye to deceit, they began to feel the weight of it pressing down on their conscience. Where abuse and neglect were once hushed behind closed doors, it became impossible to ignore. The divine grid you tapped into didn't just alter your life, it rewired the entire spiritual landscape around you. Things that were comfortably hidden in the shadows started to come into the light, and people could feel it. The heaviness in the air wasn't a coincidence. It was the undeniable truth that you had become a catalyst for transformation. You weren't just changing on the inside, you were making the invisible world around you shift. People started noticing it. The ones who were used to skating by on half-truths, manipulative behaviors, and comfortable sin began to feel uneasy. They couldn't hide anymore. The patterns they'd once relied on for control started to feel unnatural, and it left them scrambling for something to hold on to. Your presence was like a spiritual tectonic shift. Nothing would ever be the same again. The town wasn't just witnessing a person's transformation. They were seeing the very fabric of their reality be rewritten, and whether they acknowledged it or not, you had changed the atmosphere forever. Number 9. Your obedience was a prophetic bomb. Every time you said yes to God, it wasn't just a small decision, it was a prophetic detonation in the spirit realm. Each act of obedience from you sent shockwaves through unseen dimensions. What they couldn't see, what they couldn't understand, was that your alignment wasn't just about your growth, it was a force that affected everything in your environment. You think it's just you making a choice to walk in your purpose, but in reality, every yes you gave to God activated something much larger. It was like a bomb going off, quiet, unnoticed by most, but with a power that rattled the very foundations of the spiritual world. Certain people began to feel the shift almost immediately. Those who were once comfortable in their positions of power, control, or manipulation suddenly found themselves falling apart. They lost their grip on what they thought they had power over. Some fell ill, unable to continue their charades. Some lost influence, their words no longer carrying weight. Some simply vanished from your life altogether. It wasn't a coincidence. They weren't just unlucky. They were casualties of your alignment. You weren't actively trying to hurt anyone. You were just living in your truth. But the spiritual forces at play had no choice but to react when you stepped into your full purpose. People who had built their lives on deceit, control, or spiritual apathy were in danger the moment your obedience reached critical mass. They had no idea that they were walking on borrowed ground, that the power they thought they had was fragile. Your obedience detonated that fragility, and suddenly their lies, their manipulations, their wrongdoings became too heavy to carry. The spiritual forces that once allowed them to get away with it couldn't protect them anymore because your yes had aligned you with a power far greater than anything they had ever tapped into. The casualties weren't accidents. They weren't simply the result of your actions. They were the result of your obedience. You said yes, and everything that wasn't built on truth, integrity, or the divine foundation you stood on was forced to crumble. You didn't need to fight, argue, or even confront them. Your obedience was a weapon more powerful than anything they could withstand. And as long as you kept saying yes to God, the spirit realm would continue to shake. And those who weren't aligned with truth would continue to fall. Number 10. Your presence demanded accountability in a town built on hypocrisy. Your mere presence in that town was a quiet but undeniable demand for accountability. It wasn't about the words you spoke, the sermons you gave, or the advice you offered. It was about the energy you carried. You didn't have to preach for people to feel the weight of truth you walked with. Just by existing, you exposed the cracks in a town that had long been built on hypocrisy. People weren't angry with you. They were frustrated with themselves. Your presence was a constant reminder that they could no longer pretend to be something they weren't. They couldn't keep playing the game of church while standing next to you, because every move you made, every word you spoke, held up a mirror to the way they were living inauthentically. The town had grown comfortable with its routines, showing up on Sundays, quoting scripture when it was convenient, smiling in the faces of others while harboring envy, bitterness, and deceit in the heart. They had created a safe little world where the superficial and the fake could thrive. But you walked in, and suddenly, everything felt off. You didn't have to say a word, but your presence was a proclamation that what they were doing wasn't enough anymore. They couldn't mask their real selves when you were around because your very existence was a living testimony to what authenticity and alignment with God looked like. It wasn't about judging them. It was about living in truth. You didn't need to point out their flaws. They felt them in your company. They felt the weight of their hypocrisy, the tension of their double lives, the unease of pretending to be something they weren't, and it drove them mad. Not because you were the problem, but because you were the living embodiment of everything they knew they weren't. You didn't preach at them. You were the sermon, and every interaction, every glance was a call to accountability. That's why they couldn't handle you. They didn't want to face the truth. They wanted to stay comfortable in their half-truths and performative spirituality, and you, just by being, made that impossible. Your presence was a challenge to everything they were. It wasn't you judging them. It was the divine authenticity in you that made their hypocrisy impossible to ignore. And in the end, that's what truly riled them up. They were mad they couldn't hide anymore. Mad they couldn't keep pretending to be something they weren't while standing next to you. Number 11. You forced people to look at themselves and they couldn't handle the mirror. You became the mirror that no one wanted to look into, and the truth was too glaring for them to ignore. When you walked into a room, your presence didn't just occupy space. It demanded that people confront themselves in ways they had long been avoiding. You didn't need to call anyone out, point fingers, or highlight their flaws. Your mere existence exposed the cracks they buried deep inside, the lies they told themselves to stay comfortable in their own skins. You made self-deception impossible. The little stories they told themselves about who they were, what they stood for, and how they were living, they couldn't hold on to those anymore. The moment they were in your presence, the facade started to crumble. That's why they rejected you. It wasn't because they hated you. It was because they couldn't stand the reflection you forced them to see. You didn't speak a word, but your soul spoke volumes. your energy, your authenticity, your unwavering connection with truth. These things confronted everything they were too afraid to admit about themselves. It was a confrontation, but not one that required any verbal exchange. The truth in you was loud enough that it didn't need a microphone. You made them look at parts of themselves they'd spent years running from. You made them face the emptiness they had filled with distractions, the wounds they never healed, and the truths they had suppressed for far too long. This was spiritual confrontation without a word. It wasn't a fight you started. It was a reaction to your alignment with God, to the strength of your soul that forced people to reckon with their own lives. And the truth was, they couldn't handle it. It was easier to reject you than to deal with the reflection you held up. They didn't hate you. They hated the uncomfortable truth they saw when they looked your way. They couldn't stand to face the version of themselves they had been avoiding, and so they chose to avoid you instead. You didn't need to say a thing. Your very presence did the work. And that's how deep, unspoken spiritual confrontation happens. It's a challenge not to your words, but to your authenticity, to the light you carry. And that light makes it impossible to hide. Number 12. God used your walk to humble those who idolized image. God sent you into a space where image had become the altar, and those who wore the robes, held the titles, and posted the scriptures had long become the golden standard. They had mastered the art of presentation, of creating a polished exterior that looked the part, sounded the part, and made others believe they were walking in divine authority. But what they lacked was the one thing that truly mattered: revelation. And that's where you came in, an outsider with no title, no polished robes, and no impressive platform. But what you carried was far greater: the fire of God. You didn't need the accolades, the recognition, or the followers. Your walk alone was enough to make their carefully constructed world feel fragile, because you carried something real, something alive. Your existence rebuked their platform in the most quiet yet powerful way. They had religion, sure, but you had revelation. They had rules, structures, and rituals, but you had the fire that burned from within. A fire that didn't need to be seen to be known. You didn't rely on a title to validate your connection to God, because it was evident in how you lived, how you moved, and how you walked. And that's what they couldn't handle. They had perfected the art of the outward appearance, but you were a living testament to the reality that God is not just in appearances. He's in the authenticity, the heart, the fire that burns when no one else is looking. God used you to humble those who had placed their identity in their public image. The robes they wore, the scriptures they quoted, the titles they held, all of that was meaningless when compared to the raw, unshakable truth that flowed from your life. You didn't need to prove anything. Your walk spoke louder than their words ever could. It became clear that the true authority came not from being seen, but from being aligned with God in ways they could never replicate. And that alignment, that connection, was the very thing that caused their image to crumble in the face of something real. Number 13. The town didn't just talk. They were spiritually investigated for how they treated you. The moment you aligned with God, a divine investigation began. The town didn't just gossip about you, they were under spiritual surveillance. Every betrayal, every slanderous word, every covert plot to undermine you was recorded in heaven. People thought their actions were invisible, that they could operate in the shadows, and that the consequences of their treatment toward you would never catch up to them. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Heaven didn't miss a single detail, and it never forgot how they treated God's chosen vessel. When they laughed at your struggles, when they mocked your calling, when they conspired behind your back, heaven was taking note. What they didn't understand was that they weren't just messing with you. They were messing with the divine plan. They thought their words and actions would have no lasting effect, but they were mistaken. Every time they crossed the line, every time they used you as a pawn in their petty games, the spiritual realm kept a record, not to punish for the sake of punishment, but to ensure that justice would be served in due time. Now, as time has passed, those same people are beginning to feel the weight of their actions, though they may not fully understand why things are falling apart for them. The consequences they're facing aren't random. They are the result of the spiritual investigation that took place the moment they mistreated you. They're reaping what they sowed, and what they fail to realize is that heaven is not out to get them. It's simply enforcing the divine law that governs how we treat each other. What they didn't expect was that your alignment with God made you untouchable in ways they couldn't comprehend. Every time they tried to tear you down, heaven was lifting you higher. And now, as they face the repercussions of their actions, they're left confused, wondering how everything went wrong. But heaven never forgot how they treated his chosen one, and divine justice doesn't forget. What they did to you wasn't just seen, it was recorded, and now they're living out the consequences of their disregard for the divine plan. Number 14. Your walk wasn't for the town, it was for the world. From the very beginning, the town was never your final destination. They couldn't see it, but you weren't meant to stay small. Your life was never designed to be confined to their limited view of the world. The town was simply your training ground, your proving ground, a place where you learned lessons, developed strength, and became grounded in the purpose that would eventually expand far beyond their expectations. They watched you, they mocked you, they misunderstood you, but they had no idea that everything they thought was a flaw was actually part of a grand design. They saw your struggles, your growth, your alignment with God, and instead of recognizing the divine blueprint at work, they reduced you to just another local story. They couldn't fathom that your life wasn't for their validation. Their judgment, their gossip, their attempts to trap you in smallness, it was all irrelevant in the bigger picture. They had no idea that each step you took, each challenge you overcame, was shaping you into something that would impact far more than their tiny world. What they didn't realize is that your life was being mapped out as a global blueprint for spiritual awakening. Every lesson you learned, every spiritual war you fought, was not just for personal growth. It was meant to teach others. Your journey wasn't meant to stay local. It was destined to ripple out into the world, inspiring and awakening others who would walk similar paths of struggle, doubt, and eventual triumph. You were being prepared for something greater, something vast. And while they were busy mocking, studying, and dismissing you, they were missing the bigger picture. Your walk was never about impressing them or fitting into their limited expectations. It was about becoming the kind of person who could inspire nations, who could spark movements, who could awaken souls on a global scale. The town may have been where you started, but it was never where you were meant to stay. The world in all its vastness was waiting for your light to shine, and the moment you stepped into that purpose, everything shifted. They may have thought they were witnessing the end of your journey, but in truth, they were only watching the beginning of something that would change the world. In the end, the journey you walked was never about the opinions of the town, the judgments of those who couldn't see beyond their own limitations. It was always about something much bigger, a divine purpose that stretched far beyond their small world. The mockery, the betrayals, the misunderstandings, those were just the obstacles you had to overcome to step into the true power and destiny God had prepared for you. You weren't meant to fit in with their illusions of control or their shallow definitions of success. You were meant to disrupt, to awaken, and to change the spiritual landscape of not just a town, but of a generation. What they failed to realize in their envy and their attempts to break you was that the very things they tried to diminish were the seeds of your greatness. Every setback was simply a setup for the breakthrough that was coming, not just for you, but for all those who would be drawn to your light. Your walk wasn't just about personal transformation. It was a spiritual blueprint for everyone who needed a reminder that true alignment with God doesn't come from conforming to the world. It comes from embracing His calling, no matter how misunderstood, no matter how much the world tries to silence you. Now, as the dust settles and the consequences of their actions unfold, remember this: your presence has always been a testimony that proves God doesn't just choose the popular, the powerful, or the perfect. He chooses the ones who dare to walk in His truth, regardless of who stands with them or against them. Your life, your journey, and your alignment with God have always been part of a greater purpose, one that will echo through time, igniting souls and changing lives. So let them talk. Let them mock. Let them try to reduce you to their limited vision, because in the end, your walk wasn't for them. It was for the world. And the world is watching, waiting for the fire you carry to light the way. Your story is far from over. It's just beginning. If this message resonated with you, and you can feel the fire within, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of this journey. Hit that like button to let the world know you're ready for transformation, and drop a comment below. Let's keep the conversation going, because your voice matters. And don't keep this to yourself. Share it with anyone who needs to hear it, because the world is waiting for this message. Let's keep spreading truth, awakening souls, and walking boldly in the purpose we were meant for. See you in the next video.